1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, that's fine.
Our first question for you, Krishnan, we spent a long time writing this, but what was more difficult, riding from London to Paris in 24 hours or interviewing Quentin Tarantino?
Oh, that's an easy one. I mean, the bike ride is by far the hardest physical and mental thing I've ever done, because I'm not a cyclist. You know, I am a TV interviewer, and I kind of knew what I was doing with Quentin Tarantino. I wasn't in control of it, and I wasn't in control of his temper, but I wasn't hugely surprised either, because I knew he had lost it a little bit with interviewers in the past or got cross. So I wasn't entirely surprised when he did get cross, although I was surprised at how much it went on. And that's my job, you know, that's kind of what I do. Whereas doing the bike ride is just so counter to anything in my normal life. I mean, I'm not a fit person. I'm not somebody who would normally exercise. I hadn't been on a bike for about 20 years before I decided to do it. You know, I literally went into my local bike shop, which is a brilliant bike shop called Pearson's, and they're believed to be the oldest bike shop in Britain, and went in and said, look, I'm cycling to Paris, and so I need a bike. And they was like, well, right, well, what do you ride and all the rest of it? When I was like, literally, I haven't been on a bike since I was a teenager, really. So no, it was very hard.
So it's worth adding some context to why you did that ride. So was it 2015? Am I right in saying it was the first year you did it? Or
it was 2013.
2013. So yeah, add some context to why you rode to Paris, because you didn't do it just because you felt the need to ride to the Champs-Elysees alone.
No, I mean, I had a colleague and a very good friend called Emily Rubin, who worked with me on Channel 4 News. She was a reporter and presenter, and we had children at the same time, and her son is the same age as my son. And her son was diagnosed after about 5 years, I think, with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is this terrible genetic disease which involves muscle wasting, and there's no treatment for it. It's one of those quite common but very rare diseases. So thousands of people, the vast majority boys, because of the genetics, have it, but that's not really enough, you know, or wasn't really enough to get drug companies interested in putting a huge amount of resources into finding a cure, because the numbers weren't big enough to make it very profitable. And so when this looked, you know, when Emily's son was diagnosed, she looked around to see what was being done about this disease and realized not very much. And so she decided to set up a charity that would be focused purely on treatment and cure, rather than a lot of medical charities are sort of focused on supporting families and advice and lobbying and campaigning and all of that kind of thing. Duchenne UK was to be focused essentially on trying to fix this disease. And so she asked me to get involved and be a patron, and you know, and of course I said yes, and thought, well, what can I do to raise some money? And I cast around, and a colleague of mine who's a big cyclist had just ridden London to Paris, and he said, well, you could ride London to Paris. And I thought that was a ridiculous proposition, because I just didn't think it would be possible. And he said, no, it's definitely possible, and you can definitely do it, just with a bit of training. You will have to work. And so I said, okay, fine. And I decided initially just to do it. I was going to do it basically with him and a couple of friends to just accompany me. But it gradually grew and grew, with more and more people saying, well, I'd like to do that with you. So in the first year, we ended up with about 32 people who were a mixture of friends and colleagues and people I interviewed. I went to interview the head of Google in Europe, and he's a big cyclist, and we just happened to be talking about cycling. I said, well, I'm training for this ride, and and we talked about it. And then the next day he rang me and said, well, could I join you on that? I'd like to do that as well, and we'll raise money too. So it kind of grew into that. And in that first year, we raised £250,000 between 32 of us. And then it just took on a life of its own. And within a year, it was about 120, 140 people. And that's what it is pretty much every year now. And we try and raise £1 million a year.
Amazing. And am I right in saying that you attempt to do London to Paris? Is it in 24 hours?
Yeah, I mean,
which is a bit more of a challenge than London to Paris would be in other circumstances, because it is 275 miles. So it is, as you said, a challenge that pushes yourself, as opposed to sort of I wouldn't want to say easier challenge, but it is quite a hard task.
Well, our route is the most direct route, so it's not quite 275 miles, which I think it would be if you were going Dover-Calais. So we go London to Newhaven, we get the ferry from Newhaven to Dieppe, and then straight down from Dieppe to Paris. And that's about 300 kilometers. So it's about 100 kilometers on the British side and about 200 kilometers on the French side. But it's an endurance challenge, especially for, you know, amateur cyclists, people who aren't obsessed by cycling. And I think even accomplished cyclists have moments on that ride where it's difficult because, you know, you haven't slept very much and you've had this terrible ferry ride. And, you know, you start very early in the morning and it's exhilarating, but it is tough. And, you know, certainly for me, it was a real challenge and we were really scared we weren't going to be able to do it. And I had trained London to Newhaven. I'd done that leg a few times before we did it the first time. And, you know, I found it really, really hard and I would have to recover for a couple of days afterwards initially. And so the idea of doing the whole thing was scary at first. But then you realize what is possible, especially what's possible when you are spurred on by other people and carried along on that wave of excitement about what you're doing.
Yeah, fantastic. So will this be happening this year or not because of COVID?
Last year was the year we had to stop going to Paris because of COVID, and we're still unable to go to Paris because of quarantine and travel restrictions. So last year we just decided to ask people to do whatever they could in their local area. And I actually went with a couple of friends from London to Oxford to Cambridge and then back to London. This year we've got a much more organized plan, which is we've taken over the racetrack at Goodwood. And it's going to be going round and round the racetrack. They've called it, you know, the Duchenne Dash round the world, with the notion that between us, we are going to cover the distance of going around the world, which is about 40,000 kilometers. And so depending on how many people join us, we will have to do, you know, anything between 150 kilometers and 400. And I think we've got a total capacity of about 300 riders. And at the moment, we've got about 150 riders signed up, because that's the sort of the normal batch size of the Duchenne Dash. But you know, we're up for expanding it. So if people who are listening fancy doing this, it's going to be really good fun. It's really well organized. That was the kind of our sort of our USP right from the beginning. When we decided to go London to Paris, even though we were a small group, we decided we had to do this in a sort of very boutique, hyper supported way. So we had a big support entourage, even in that first year. And we planned our food and drink stops incredibly well. And we had mechanics and outriders. And we now are escorted all the way through France with motorbikes, who basically do a rolling roadblock and stop all the traffic as we ride through. So you don't ever actually have to stop at a traffic light or a junction in France. And so we've continued that principle on the Goodwood ride, and I think it will be a lot of fun.
Is there a time limit for you guys on this occasion, as there is for going, or there was for London Paris?
Well, it's going to be less just because of the practicalities of taking over a place like Goodwood. So I think, in fact, the riding time is more like 12 hours. And that will mean it's a bit more intense. There'll be less time to stop, because on London to Paris, even though it's a long way, we do have quite a lot of feed stops. We have a couple of stops in particular where you get a good hour, basically, and we have the ferry ride over from Newhaven to Dieppe, which is a few hours in which to try and have a bit of a rest. Whereas this will be pretty much non-stop with whatever breaks people need.
Nice. And will your colleague John Snow be joining you? Because he's a cyclist as well, isn't he? I've seen him around London on a very, very tall Condor, because he's a tall gentleman.
Yeah, I mean, like he genuinely uses his bike every day to commute around. He's not going to be on this one, I don't think. He's joined us in the past for usually the final leg. So he will either see us off from London, or sometimes he has got the train out to France and joined us on that sort of final leg between, as we roll into Paris, and come for that. So it's always good fun to get a little bit of a lift from that. But he's not going to be on this one, I don't think. But yeah, I mean, I am sort of very much a fair weather cyclist, and I get involved in cycling when I'm training for the Dash, and I do then genuinely enjoy it, and do it, and commute a lot. I live about 9 miles from the office, and so cycling to and from work is just a good way for me to sort of try and keep fit or get fit when I'm training for the Dash. But I'm useless in that pretty much as soon as I've done the Dash, I then stop and I lose all my fitness within about 6 to 8 weeks, and put on loads of weight. And then once that's happened, I then become paralyzed by the idea of getting back on the bike, and it takes me absolutely ages. It makes no sense at all. It's really, really stupid. And every year I say to myself, just keep riding, just keep doing it, and it'll be fine. And then you won't go through this hell every year of having to get fit again. But I never learn.
Well, I think strangely that makes you more of a cyclist than you realise, because that is the classic boom and bust of your pro cyclist. Is they actually smash it for 9 months of the year, and then typically foot off the gas at the end of the season, and then pile on the pounds, put their feet up, don't ride again until they get whipped into shape on a team camp in Spain. So I think the psychology behind your approach, Krishnan, is bob on.
Really? That's very surprising, actually. All the cyclists I know are just incredibly lithe and do it all the time, and think nothing of 5 hours at 6 a.m. on a Sunday before their actual day begins.
So in 2013, when you decided to do the first Duchenne ride to Paris, talk us through the nerves of knowing, because you just said there you get this sort of anxiety when you know that you've got to start training again. But what was it like the first time when you know that in front of you is this quite mammoth task, and you haven't, as you said, ridden a bike really since you were a teenager?
I was genuinely scared that I wouldn't be able to do it, and that I wouldn't be able to keep up. And I did fall back. We were really chaotic in the first year because we didn't all stick together. We all started just drifting apart. And you'd ride with one person for a bit, and then another person for a bit, and a couple of us got lost. And but then we would meet up at stops along the way. But I was genuinely scared that I wouldn't be able to do it. And to be honest, I still am. I haven't done it every year, but I try and do it whenever I can. And I still find it scary that I'm not really able to do this and not going to be able to keep up with people. I find that bit really psychologically difficult. The idea of staying in a group and keeping to other people's speed. Sorry, can you hear all this banging and crashing? I've got some builders next door who are...
No, it's okay. It's fine, Krishnan. Compared to some of the guests we've had out in Italy who have had like pneumatic drills in the same room.
I think there may even be a pneumatic drill quite soon. But anyway, if that happens, we'll stop for a second. So I really lack confidence when it comes to my ability to do anything like that. And so I did find it very hard, and still do, even though I know I've done it and therefore I can do it again. I guess every year I think, well, I've been lazy this year. I haven't properly trained. I'm not as fit as I was before. And so I'm going to really struggle. And I've also got a heart condition that's been diagnosed now since the first time I did it. And the cardiologist will say, you've got to be really careful. You can't really push yourself to extremes. And you mustn't race or anything like that. So I can't do sort of high intensity. So going up hills and things like that becomes a real challenge, because attacking hills, which obviously you've got to try and do to some extent, becomes a bit scary for me. And I kind of think, right, well, really no point killing yourself on a sponsored ride. So, it becomes quite slow and grindy and difficult for me. But you go through waves, and that's the sort of the exhilaration of doing a ride like that, where you're finding it really, really hard. And then you look up and you're in this amazing sort of field of poppies in northern France, and it's just beautiful. And you look ahead and you've got this big long line of cyclists on a country road, and that's all you really see. And it's very uplifting. And you kind of think, wow, all these people who are just doing this to raise money for this thing. And you get really carried along by that, I think, and you're able to do things that I certainly wouldn't normally be able to do. And particularly that last 80 kilometers, I'd say, I'm absolutely exhausted, but suddenly you get this huge lift. And so by the time you're riding through Paris, on the outskirts of Paris, and the French are amazing when they see these long pelotons of sponsored cyclists. You can imagine in Britain, if you stopped the traffic for more than a couple of minutes, people would be absolutely furious and they'd be driving out and trying to run you over and all the rest of it. In France, they genuinely love it, and they get out of their cars and they applaud and they cheer, and they're absolutely brilliant. And so by the time you're at that stage, it's so exhilarating. And that we all speed up and we all end up racing along the Champs-Élysées and down to the finish line by the Eiffel Tower. And it's absolutely brilliant.
Fantastic. So given that sounds like those are kind of the moments of elation. What have been, or what was your darkest hour on a bike?
My darkest hour on a bike. I've probably had a few.
You can include the commutes, because often commutes are pretty pretty dark places.
Yeah. I mean, my darkest hour on a bike is probably along a stretch of the Duchenne Dash on the first or second time I did it, where I started to think I wasn't going to be able to carry on. And there's a section in northern France where it's just quite grindy and relentless, and it's quite a long stretch, and you've been up since 4 or 5 in the morning, and it's been cold, and then it sort of it warms up, but you're tired and you haven't eaten properly, because you really struggle to eat breakfast at 5 in the morning when you've got to get on the bike and you haven't slept and you're tired and you're a bit disorientated. And so I think I went through a very hard patch on that ride for quite a few miles, where I just thought, I'm just going to fall back, and maybe I'll get there tomorrow or something, and just do this at my own pace, and didn't really think I'd be able to carry on. But you get through it, and people accompany you, and I had some brilliant friends who were with me who just kind of slowed down and waited for me and carried on, gave me occasional push up a hill, and got me through it. I mean, normally the dark times on the bike are just cars, aren't they? And the way they treat you. I spend my time when I'm commuting, as I'm sure most cyclists do, just sort of shouting at people and shouting at cars, and because you see the car at the junction ahead, and you're just going, "Don't you fucking dare," and they do always, and it's just kind of annoying, and or when I don't understand. I mean, I know Jeremy Vine, a friend of mine, and former colleague, films all of these things all the time and posts them on Twitter, every sort of furious moment. And I don't really know how he has the energy, because it's all the time, as far as I can tell.
It seems daily, doesn't it?
Day. Yeah. So, those are sort of dark moments in a way, and that they're kind of an insight into human behavior and human psychology, and the way some people behind cars seem to genuinely hate cyclists and almost want them to fall over, I think. I think I've been on a bit of a journey myself, as a road user, somebody who just never ever cycled, and did used to find cyclists irritating from time to time if they'd get in your way and all the rest of it. And I think I was probably a bit of an inconsiderate driver at times. And then as soon as you get on a bike, you suddenly realize, how stupid so many drivers are. And you very quickly go, well, I don't want to be like that anymore. Or if you go out with your kids on a bike, which I've obviously done since doing the dash, you suddenly become aware of how dangerous the roads are. So I think I've, fundamentally changed my own approach to the roads as well. So I do understand to some degree, but it's quite an insight, I think, into people, and sort of selfishness, being on a bike, which I don't think cyclists are immune from either. I mean, to be honest, I remember the first time I went down the bike lane on the embankment, and I absolutely hated it because of the other cyclists. I thought there were so many really selfish, aggressive cyclists on that road.
It's genuinely, I find often, I rode that quite a bit, is it's more dangerous than the actual road on the embankment, is the segregated cycle lane, because as you said, you can have everything from someone on a Boris bike doing 10k an hour to, and I've seen people on full-on time trial bikes doing sort of 45k an hour, and it's like this madness of moving parts that it just feels like it's a crash waiting to happen.
Yeah, and you often feel really under pressure, I think, when you've got a fast cyclist coming up behind you, in a way that I no longer feel pressure from traffic. I mean, I cycle the way I drive, and I often on the same routes. So I take the same sort of shortcuts and, cycle quite aggressively, I suppose, to sort of hold the road and hold my position, and to get to work as quickly as possible. But I don't, I certainly don't harass other people on the road, but you kind of, you really feel that pressure from other cyclists when they are much faster than you and they're coming up behind you and you're in their way. And particularly on those segregated cycle lanes, I find it really awful. So I don't use them at all now.
Do you get recognised on your commute? And is that a kind of a burden of responsibility on your shoulders of, if I were to be involved in any kind of altercation and people do have mobile phones, suddenly I'm all over Twitter. So I've got to kind of back off a little bit and bite my tongue? Or have there been those times where you haven't and someone's gone, "Oi, you're that bloke off the telly," and you're like, "Oh dear."
A good case in point is last year around Regent's Park, a cyclist caught, I think it was Guy Ritchie, on his phone trying to go the wrong way down the road at Regent's Park. And that was just, he had a camera, and because it's Guy Ritchie, otherwise it wouldn't have been a big thing. But
yeah, I mean, I do occasionally get recognized. I mean, I hate being recognized mainly because if I'm wearing, lycra, it's not a pretty size. But if I take routes along big, busy roads like Oxford Street or something like that, which I sometimes do if I'm going to work, then people will recognize you at the lights, and it changes your behavior a bit in that, you're never going to jump a red light. You're not going to break the rules because somebody's going to see you, and it would be not a good look. I mean, I'm not a sort of a red light jumper anyway. I've cycled with people who are, and I kind of think you're just mad. It's so dangerous. But yeah, I'm probably more observant and perhaps considerate as a cyclist than I might otherwise be, because there's always that risk that someone's going to go, "Oh, it's him." And if you think about the times that David Cameron and Boris Johnson have been followed on their bikes and filmed, and now everyone's got a camera anyway, you can't do anything. Cameras absolutely everywhere, so you're never going to be, you're never going to get away with anything. So best to be super observant.
Absolutely. I think we've mentioned it on the show before, but one of my all-time favorite cycling pictures is of Boris coming towards the camera, and then a guy cycling towards him away from camera, flipping him the bird simultaneously.
Yeah.
And it's just such a perfect, at that time, it sort of summed up Britain. But no,
not really, if you think about what actually happened.
Well, yeah. But to try on a more positive note, when you're not having to fight the commute on the daily grind, where have you been riding? And do you put yourself into cycling holidays? And will you be doing one anytime soon?
The only cycling holiday I've done is Ile de Ré in France, which was a sort of a family cycling experience where it wasn't really a family holiday. It wasn't really a cycling holiday. It was a holiday on a place where everybody cycles everywhere. And so we took the bikes on the car and drove down and were on the bikes every day and just used it to get around, because that's how people get around on Ile de Ré. And I don't know if you've been there, but I mean, it's a lovely little place. It's a bit sort of Notting Hill on Sea now, but but it's it's this gorgeous island full of nice little towns, and you can drive around it, but it's a bit mad to try. And everybody's on bikes on bike tracks, so that's the sort of the most cycling I've done on holiday. And we'll go through phases of taking the bike or even renting bikes. I rented a bike in Mallorca to train once, which was just much easier than packing my bike up and putting it in the bag and flying with it and all the rest of it. And renting a car that's big enough to then put your bike in the bike back in the back. So I got a number for an outfit there who delivered a Pinarello to my the flat where we were staying, and used that for a week. So yeah, I mean, I've done that kind of thing, but I don't think I'm serious enough to go on a proper cycling holiday, a proper cycling enduring holiday, endurance holiday. And my wife would never do it with me. She's a runner rather than a cyclist, and so I think trying to persuade her to do that would be tricky.
But talking about serious, let's talk about. So you still own a Pearson, right? I saw a picture of. I saw a picture. I believe it was dated 2015 with you on a Pearson that had disc brakes, and I remarked to James how you were such an early adopter of disc brake technology, which is even now, even I haven't fully embraced it, as James would tell you, because I'm still in the 1990s.
The youngest Luddite we know.
Yeah, I mean, that bike actually in 2015 was one I borrowed from Pearson's for the election campaign. I did a bike ride across the north of England during the election, where we cycled from Whitby Bay to Salford, stopping along the way and talking to people and making little films. And we'd do an outside broadcast every night from a different location across the north of England. And Pearson's lent me that bike for that, which was great fun. And it was their newest technology. It was a titanium bike with disc brakes, and it was really different, very different to my bike. I've got a carbon Pearson bike with traditional old calipers, and it's still the same bike that I did the first dash on in 2013. And I do every so often think about updating it, but it still looks good and it's going well. And so I've still got it, but I try not to get sucked in too much to all the technology. I mean, I really enjoyed, using Di2 gears and hydraulic disc brakes and all that kind of thing. And if I do get a bike, then I'm sure it will have all the toys. But I'm not sure it really makes that much difference, if I'm being honest.
I agree, Krishnan, and I work for a site, which I shouldn't admit.
Don't say that, Joe. We need to drive consumerism in our industry. Employed. But
I did also buy an e-road bike. I mean, that was the really big and rather stupid investment I made.
Oh no, e-bikes are 100% the future, and we should all be investing in them. They are the most fun you can have.
Well, I'm not sure actually, because I've got it and I've actually sold it.
Really? What did you get?
Yeah, I mean, I got a Trek e-road bike, and it was horrifically expensive, and very advanced and really exciting when I got it. And it's quite good fun to ride, because it's quite, it gets you going quite fast, quite quickly. But I stopped using it because I realized that it was great for me when I was unfit. But as soon as I became a little bit fit, I found it really frustrating around London, because I didn't need it. It was stopping me maintaining my fitness, because you can be so lazy with an e-bike. And I didn't really need it. and actually quite often I wanted to go faster than you really can on an e-bike, because they're so heavy that once you're pedaling faster than 25 kilometers an hour, which is when the motor cuts out, if you haven't de-restricted it illegally, you're having to work really, really hard to go anywhere above 25k. That it feels really weird, and it doesn't have the handling of a normal bike. So I found myself actually wanting to get back onto my unassisted bike quite quickly, and so I decided to sell it. And so, this is the point of cycling for me, is actually to try and maintain a little bit of fitness, and an e-bike is bad for me because it's going to make me lazy. And also, to be honest, I'd also thought, the great thing about an e-bike will be that I can cycle in my suit and not get sweaty and not have to get changed and all that kind of stuff. But it's not really true. You still can't really cycle in your suit because you just wear the trousers out.
Very true. And you do sweat. You've just got where you need to be a little bit quicker, but you're still sweaty.
Yeah.
But they are good fun, though.
They're great. I mean, they're great on holiday and things like that, or if they're great, on hills. If you just want a lazy bike ride, it's absolutely brilliant powering up hills on an e-bike. But it rather defeats the object of going on that kind of bike ride.
But speaking of plush bikes, then, and you mentioned your colleagues at ITN, lots of them do ride. Who's got the best bike, and who's got the bike where it's like, for goodness sake, please replace that? It's a death trap.
Well, one of my friends who does the Dash a lot has been incredibly unlucky in that he's had 2 crashes, I think, and broken bikes. But so he keeps getting new bikes. So he's always got the newest, poshest bike. And he's just ordered a new Pearson, in fact, which looks really, really swanky and has got electronic everything and hydraulic discs and is going to be gorgeous when it arrives. But a lot of people have got really scruffy bikes that they use at work. And actually, to be honest, probably the best cyclist that we have, the one, well, maybe not the best, but the one who inspired me and told me to do the Dash in the first place, is our studio director. And, he's got a nice bike, but I think he's had it a while, and he's very disciplined at not upgrading it too much. So I've got to be careful because I don't want to insult his bike. he'll be really upset. But no, I mean, in fact, I'm trying to think what the brand is. One of my friends, I've got a friend who did the Dash a few years ago from work, who didn't even have her own bike. She just borrowed a friend's bike, and it was a really rubbish sort of one of those really cheap aluminium brands, and I can't remember what it was now, but she did it, sort of for all the toys and the lightness and the great technology that we try and get because they're fun. She proved that if you're fit, you can just do it on pretty much anything. And we've had people do that Dash on a Boris bike, on tandems, on a Brompton. So you can do those rides if you're fit and know what you're doing on pretty much anything.
Wow, Brompton, that would be the Boris bike. I think that would probably be the hardest one.
Yes.
They are like tractors. Good fun, but
well, trying to go up some of those hills on a Boris bike, I don't know how he did it. He must have been absolutely super fit.
So obviously you're a Channel 4 newsreader, and as cyclists, me and James grew up with watching Tour de France coverage on Channel 4. Historically, obviously, people like Gary Imlach. If cycling was to ever come back to Channel 4, would you be keen to put your hand up as to get involved with the sort of presenting side? Because obviously you've done much more than just read the news. You've presented sort of documentaries, etc. But would you ever be tempted to get to sort of dip your toe into something like that and try something new?
I would really like to do a cycling show that wasn't really just about the sport. I can't pretend to know anything about the sport of cycling, really. I mean, I can get by in terms of news coverage and the Tour de France or the Giro or whatever it might be. in terms of what's going on in terms of the headlines, but I'm not knowledgeable. And so I think for programs like that, you really want experts. You want people who know what they're talking about. And it would just be frustrating for people at home to watch somebody like me presenting sports cycling on the telly. I would really like to do a show about cycling in real life, you know, but for people's lives, you know, cycling that is about a show that's really about, you know, commuting, holidays, technology. I like all that sort of, you know, the gizmos and early adopting stuff. So I do, you know, I try not to get sucked into it because it's expensive and it's a black hole, but I do enjoy all of that. So that kind of show, I mean, Channel 5 used to do a show a bit like that, didn't they? If that kind of show came back, then yeah, that would be really good fun. But I would never pretend to know what I'm talking about. So I wouldn't want to do a proper serious cycling show.
And a show to make cycling seem normal, I feel. Because I feel in the UK, as you spoke about when you went to Ile de Ré in France, cycling's just accepted. People get on a bike to go to the grocery store, whereas in the UK, it's not the case. If you cycle, it's because you're a
weirdo.
Weirdo or a competitive cyclist.
Yeah. Certainly in the media. I mean, I think that's changing a little bit. You know, and more people have been cycling. Certainly cycled during lockdown, and got bikes and used them. And so I think that has changed a little bit in terms of the image of cycling, and cycling is much more normal. And in the cities, you know, people are commuting much more. I've got friends who I can't believe are now cycling to work. I've got one friend in particular who I've tried to persuade to do the Dash a few times, and he would always just say, cycling's not my thing. And now he cycles to work every day, and it's about a 6 or 7 mile commute. So I think those things have changed a little bit, but I think in the media, you know, yes, it's still a specialist thing, and it's very male. It's, you know, it's a particular type of person, I think, and it would be great if that changed and was broken down a bit.
Yeah, I mean, how important do you see the media's portrayal of cycling in terms of how you know, the uptake of cycling in Britain and the media's influence on that? And it's kind of a two-part question. How often do you literally just despair at certain media outlets, Daily Mail, who potentially don't exactly say the most unincendiary things about the situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think, again, I hope it's changing a bit. I mean, I think sort of the portrayal of cyclists as, you know, always selfish, always dangerous, and irritating and self-righteous, you know, is a bad stereotype. I mean, unfortunately, you know, these stereotypes come about because, you know, there is some truth somewhere in there. You know, there's always a hint of, you know, there's something on which to base that. But I kind of get this. I'm a bit more sort of hopeful, really, actually, that so many people in the media. I think, you know, there's a lot of cyclists in the media now. So, and I think probably always have been. And so I think media portrayal of cyclists is probably, I hope, less of a problem than it has been in the past. I think the trouble is that you're always going to get certain people, you know, and in the current sort of anti-PC, anti-woke, anti-everything kind of times that we live in, it's easy to have a pop at cyclists, and there are going to be certain populists who will do that. But then, you know, there's always surprising things as well. Like, you know, you would, you know, when Jeremy Clarkson became, you know, revealed that he actually got on a bike and quite liked cycling around London, it was quite surprising and quite good. And so I think that whole, you know, anti-cycling thing feels a bit old-fashioned. I don't know, am I out of touch? Do you still feel it's a problem?
I feel like it, for a lot of people, it has got boring, and especially in the last year, there's been this sort of it's accelerated towards acceptance because we had to, because we were living in a society where we couldn't get a train, a bus like we once would, and we weren't driving as much. But I do think you'll always have your stalwarts out there, your Nick Ferraris on LBCs, who ultimately I think a lot of the time do it to be contrarians. They want to just have an argument to have on their radio show because it gets listeners in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we've both been I don't know if you have, James. I've been invited onto Nick Ferrari's show to debate cycle lanes with him previously. And I think it's just because it's quite an easy, for their listenership, it's quite an easy topic for them to get people on board with. But I think in a large way, as you said, Krishnan, I think there has been a sort of a wave towards acceptance.
I mean, I think you're right. There's a backlash at the moment over the cycle lanes, which is very boring and is sort of very much a certain section of the media that drives it. And, unfortunately at the moment, I think, because quite a lot of those new cycle lanes that were put in during lockdown don't seem busy most of the time, because of course they're not busy during the daytime, because that's not when people are cycling to work. They become easy targets. We've got a similar debate literally around the corner from where I live, and I'm on the board of Kew Gardens, and it's quite difficult because Kew Road has had a cycle lane put down it, so the place where visitors to the gardens used to park can't be used anymore, and it affects the visitors, and it drives traffic onto the local roads. And so now they've put in residents parking on my road, so that the traffic that was being displaced can't park here, and it does wind people up, because if you come into this area, there's nowhere to park now. But that's not the problem. The problem is solve the parking problem and the traffic problem and the why people are driving here in the first place problem. Don't blame the cyclists, because the cycle lane is a good thing.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ultimately, yeah, it's a tough one, because it's we had Chris Boardman on recently, and he spoke quite a bit in depth about this. It's about just eventually it will become accepted and it will become just part of our society, but it's just pushing through and having the courage to keep continuing with stuff like bike lanes and low traffic neighborhoods. And look at Soho, for instance, where a year ago you could drive your car through Soho, now you can't, and everyone just accepts that's going to be the case forever now, is that it's a pedestrianised area, and everyone actually realises this is a much more pleasant place to be when you haven't got to look out for cars, and you can sort of be more relaxed. And I feel like there will just be eventually, I don't know, we've also got to consider I'm quite London centric in my view, in that London's quite different to if you go to to Bradford or Birmingham, where it's probably quite a bit different. But
I think speed limits are the issue as well, on that one, in that people are having to adjust to 20-mile-an-hour speed zones, which they find really irritating, and they're enforced by cameras. So you've just got to yield to it and go, yeah, that's the way things are now. You can't escape this. You can't break the law. You've just got to slow down. And one of the consequences of that is it becomes safer for cyclists. The trouble is cyclists are often going faster than 20 miles an hour. So if you drive through Richmond Park, which I often do to take my daughter to school, the traffic's driving at 20 miles an hour and the cyclists are overtaking you. Which is difficult.
You're always when you cycle through London, you're always the fastest thing on the road as a bike, which is in a way quite enjoyable, actually, knowing that you can beat a car or a bus from A to B.
That's right.
Part of the pleasure of having a bike in a city, I always find.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, that's for me, it's always been because of traffic lights and traffic jams. Although I've always seen traffic lights as my friend personally. I always stop at traffic lights because that's my breather. But and I never try and beat the lights. If I see the lights are about to change, I'm very happy to slow down and pause. But yeah, I mean, traditionally you get around quicker because of queues. But now I find a lot of cyclists are just going faster than the traffic, because cyclists are going faster than 20 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And it's quite easy to do that. I was doing that myself, actually, not long ago, coming home, and I was with my friend from work, and we quite often would cycle home the same way. And we were just talking, and I think we just got carried away. And I only noticed when I was cycling down Holland Park Avenue, overtaking a bus. and suddenly had one of those, oh my God, what am I doing moments? This is mad, you know. So I do think we should probably all slow down a bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is it. I think there's so many problems. And this is, I'm sure, A, preaching to the converted, and B, certainly nothing new, can be solved by common sense. And I'm going to admit to you, this is going to be quite a tenuous link, but it's just a question that I wanted to ask you in general when I knew you were coming on the show. You are a man of common sense. You are a newsreader, clearly a very erudite, well-educated individual, and you must find yourself not just reading a story out about cycling and where you're kind of tearing your hair out thinking, this is just not helpful, but other stuff about, you know, politics in general, particularly. How do you kind of square that away? How do you not erupt sometimes or just refuse point blank to want to deliver a certain piece of news because you know it's not going to be helpful to the wider debate and to people, which is, you know, who you're there to serve?
Well, your personal opinions are just something you've got to put aside, and you get used to that. That's the deal. And when you enter this job, you know, you have to put aside what you think. And it's funny because people often these days think they know what you think or what your politics are, and that if you're doing an interview a certain way, it's because what you think. I mean, people kind of lost their ability to be discerning about these things and seem to have forgotten that we're doing a job. And so if I ask a question that you might think is a sort of a stupid question from your point of view, it's not because that's what I think, it's because it's my job to ask questions from every different angle. And so you do just put aside your personal opinion and, you know, and concentrate on trying to do a public service. In terms of reporting news that you don't think is helpful, I feel that's a different thing. I mean, I would not report in a way that I think is deliberately unhelpful or misleading or, you know, just sort of shit stirring, because that's not my job. I mean, you know, we're trying to do the best we possibly can in terms of telling people important stuff that they need to know and want to debate. So yeah, you just try not to react, and you personally, and to be honest, when you're doing the news, you've got quite a lot to think about. So whether it's technical or practical or what you're going to ask or what's coming up next or what's the best way to approach this next interview. So your personal opinion of what's going on, it just doesn't come to the fore in my case. And it may just be training. It may just be, you know, if you've been doing it for 30 years, then that's the way you do it. And that was the deal when you entered, you know, this trade. And maybe that's changing because I think, you know, more media is now more openly opinionated. And there used to be a very clear division. Basically, if you were a broadcast journalist, you had to buy into impartiality and fairness and, you know, giving all sides a fair hearing. And if you were a print journalist, then you could take sides and you could favor the opinions of your editor or your proprietor. Those lines have all blurred now because everybody's doing everything, and everybody's doing video and audio and podcasts and you know, all that kind of thing. So it's very hard to tell the difference just visually between a piece of content by the BBC or Channel 4 and a piece of content by, you know, somebody else who wants to be openly biased. So I think these things are changing and getting a bit harder. But, you know, for me personally, your job is to try and ask, you know, the important questions that matter that people are asking at home. I think there's a slight difference with a program like Channel 4 News or Newsnight, where I've also worked, or the Today program, in that we're not like a news bulletin. You know, we'll quite often do an analysis of the news, or we'll come at a particular story from a particular angle. And again, people sometimes these days misunderstand this, but it's not a personal view angle. It's just, let's look at it this way, and then maybe do an interview looking at it the other way to, you know, to answer that. So yeah, I don't know whether that makes it clear. Yeah, we do basically try and sort of highlight what we think is important about the news, but we try not to give opinion.
And in a similar vein, something that James and I have been in situations where we've had to interview professional cyclists, and one of the topics of discussion quite commonly is doping, and it's a topic that 9 times out of 10 a cyclist will not want to talk to you about. But you have to bring it up, and you've probably been in very similar circumstances where you've had interview guests where everyone in the room knows that that question, there'll be a particular question needing to be asked, and the interviewee probably doesn't want to ask it. Do you ever have you ever got quite nervous about having to sort of pose a particular question to a guest before? Has there been a time where you've almost stopped yourself because you know that it's going to make the interview so tense? Obviously now with your experience, it's kind of sort of comes with practice, but was there ever a time where you're like, I don't know if I can ask this question because I don't know how it's going to go?
I mean, my job is asking the unpopular question, and the question that people don't want to be asked. And so you just have to get over the idea of interviewees liking you. There are some people on the news who want to be liked and want to be loved. And if that's your aim, then you're just not going to be able to do your job very well. And so you have to accept that a lot of interviewees are going to be very wary of you. They're not going to particularly like you. They may not like you at the end of the interview. You've just kind of got to hope that they think you're being fair and that, you're asking a question that's legitimate. And it's very rare that people actually think what you've asked is illegitimate. Even if they don't want to answer that question, they don't really want to talk about that thing. They know that it is entirely reasonable for you to raise it, and if you're and to challenge them. And most people don't agree to do interviews without realizing that. Very, very occasionally people will get angry or walk out, or and I've had a couple of famous examples of that. But I think mostly people understand that if you put yourself up for interview, you're going to be asked questions. And the difficulty is, when you really like somebody, I suppose, and you don't want to upset them, and you don't want to, you'd quite like to get on with them afterwards and all the rest of it, but that you've got to ask the hard question, and that they're not going to like it. And you feel a little bit apologetic sometimes, but you can't ever say that, and you can't ever reveal that, because, you will instantly change the tone, I think, of the interview and make it easier for them to evade it. And I think sometimes I do, I have had times where I kind of think, wouldn't it be easier to be one of those, softer interviewers who doesn't ask the hard question, but is liked as a result, both by your interviewees and all their supporters. It's not easy, especially these days, in the days of social media, to ask an unpopular question and then ride out the sort of the torrent of abuse and fury that you're going to get on Twitter and Instagram and all the rest of it.
And a shared experience, I think we've both, in both our industries, again, yours is much more sort of important, is that I feel now is you can be frozen out quite easily. And I think Channel 4 experienced this last year, where there was certain points where you weren't being granted interviews with certain members of, I believe, cabinet. And we've had the same, in that we once published an article on Lance Armstrong. He took umbrage to it, and therefore we were never allowed to talk to him. And we've had it with, there are certain people in the world of cycling as we speak who we've written about, or we've sort of done content on, and then we've kind of been frozen out by their representatives or their teams. And it puts you in an awkward position, because you see others around you who realize that, so therefore maybe don't ask the questions that you think should be asked.
And I think it's a genuine dilemma, I think, for topics like yours, where you can say, for me it's easy, if I'm talking about politics or COVID or wars or anything really, really serious, no one's going to question really the legitimacy of asking tough questions on that. It's when you stray into the arts, film, should I really have been asking a serious question of Quentin Tarantino. You know, what is it fair to try and hold them to account? He's not a politician. I think that's when, you know, it does get trickier as you get into those areas. And, you know, cycling may be one of those where you think, well, they're sports people, you know, they're not trying to run the country. To what extent do you need to haul them over the coals and hold them to account? On the other hand, you say, well, hang on, you know, this is a big industry. They become national figures, national heroes. They're held up, you know, as great examples, and they have to abide by standards and follow the law and follow the laws of the sport. And if they don't, well, they should be held to account for it. So, but you know, I think it is really hard. And I do a lot of those sort of cultural interviews as well. You can't treat them the way you would treat a cabinet minister because they are fundamentally different. But equally, you kind of want to ask the question about their own personal standards and personal behavior. And it's a difficult balance to strike because you will be, you know, you will be shut out or you know, hit back at to differing degrees.
Yeah, I mean, so because that's another element of it, which is you know, you have to ask those questions, and they will be very evasive often with an answer. And I saw you the other night on Channel 4 interviewing Tobias Elwood, and I can't remember what you asked him. It's something to do around, you know, are you guys backing Matt Hancock or not? Just give me an answer. What do you think? And he just wouldn't do it. And you had that kind of answer the question minister moment. And in that moment, because I would sort of from my armchair think you're getting a little bit frustrated, but are you kind of over-egging the frustration in order to pile the pressure on? Or is there just part of you it's just like, flipping heck, mate, come on, just give us an answer?
There are times when it is just flipping heck, answer the question. You know, don't try and reframe the debate. And it's become so common for people now to just try and reframe your question and answer what they want to ask. And answer what they want to answer rather than answer your question. That's, you know, there are different ways of tackling it. Sometimes you just have to point out what they're doing and say, well, you know, we can all see what you're doing. You're not answering the question, you're answering your question. I'd rather it if you answered my question. And sometimes you do get a bit annoyed. I mean, I think if they are, you know, especially if they're in a political position and they are just point blank ignoring your question, you know, it is a bit annoying sometimes. And the most important thing to do is to point out to the viewer what's going on and to point out to them that you've noticed what they're doing. And that if they think they're going to get away with this without anybody realizing or pointing it out, then they're not. Because ultimately you can't force people to answer the question. You can't force people to address what you're saying. And if they are coming on and just want to plow their own line and say what they've come on to say, you can't stop them, but you can point out what they're doing and say, I noticed that you're not answering my question. And so, right, let's move on to the next topic. And yeah, I mean, there have been times when it does get you know, it's annoying for viewers at home, and you feel it too, because you feel it's your job to try and get those answers.
Does it ever, because so I'm projecting now, this keeps me up at night, that we've entered a world of the Orwellian double think and double speak, where you can just say anything, there is no truth, and somehow that flies, and even though people question it, the questions somehow don't get answered. Does that worry you from an unbiased position as a newscaster? And what are we going to kind of do about it? Is there hope? Do we have to move away from newspapers and TV and get onto social media for truths? Or is actually the social media side of things what's killing the truth because it's creating its own facts purely through voices and momentum?
Yeah, I think social media is not where you go for truth. And so, no, I don't think that's the answer at all. And social media has been disastrous on this, you know, for so many different reasons, in that people can just say things that are completely untrue, unchallengeable, because there's no interaction. It's a big question, that, and it's kind of, it's partly to do with the communication strategies of people in power. And, those in power have become much cleverer at avoiding proper scrutiny. So if you think about the press conferences that we've all been sitting through during COVID, which look like a big exercise in transparency, but in truth aren't, because they're on Zoom for a start. So the journalist only gets to speak when the microphone is turned on, which they control. And you don't get any return 9 times out of 10. It's up to the minister or whoever's holding the press conference whether they come back to you and say, "Oh, do you want to come back on that?" Or do they just move on to the next person? And 9 times out of 10, they will just move on. So there's no real ability to say, "Well, that's interesting, but you didn't really answer my question on whatever it was. Could you just address that?" You don't get that return. So there's no, proper scrutiny is really, really hard. And it's only really possible if people do long interviews. Even the short interview is very, very difficult, because in 3 minutes or whatever a news interview might normally be, you've got time for the statement, a challenge, maybe another challenge, another statement, and then time's up. So it's only if you've got a reasonable amount of time to actually drill into something that you can really try and hold people to account, which is one of the reasons I really like doing the podcast, which I do, which is not really about holding people to account, but it's having long conversations in which you can actually explore things. So I think people just saying things that are blatantly untrue is a really difficult problem now, because the opportunities to hold them to account and challenge them are not there often. And particularly in a world of social media, things that are blatantly untrue can just be amplified and repeated by armies of people. And you don't even know whether those armies of people are real. They might be social media factories. So, yeah, I mean, truth is a hard thing to come by now, and it's quite precious, and you've got to work out where it is. I mean, I find this with my kids, trying to educate them about what is trusted media and where they can seek the truth. It's quite hard. When I was growing up, and I imagine even when you were growing up, it was relatively easy to work out what were trusted media outlets. These days, there is so much out there, and quite a lot of new ones. It's very hard. So you'll find yourself having conversations with teenagers where they go, "Oh, did you hear about such and such? Did you hear about Anonymous? He's trying to bring down the government." And you go, "No, that's rubbish." Did you watch Channel 4 News tonight, where we had an actual whistleblower from the government leaking government documents, and that was really important, and that was real? And sort of trying to explain to them the difference between trusted and untrustworthy media is quite hard.
Yeah, and as you said, even in our sphere, cycling, which is so small and insignificant, we come up against these problems every single day. I've always said that one of the hardest things is people are too media trained these days, so you don't actually get any interesting answers, because they've been trained within an inch of their life to be able to just regurgitate what the guy who's always standing over your shoulder as well, normally in our case, has told them to say. Yeah, so one of the big problems in cycling since the Lance Armstrong days is that the control that a press person has basically on the pro cyclist. And 9 times out of 10, if you're granted an interview, that press person will be present, and they'll be sort of stepping in. And access as well. Access to sports people is few and far between, and it's getting worse. Which is annoying, actually, because if you look back 15, 20 years, you could have quite interesting stories and go quite in depth with people, and you'd actually learn more about them. But now it's very guarded, and it's very much cherry picked who they talk to and what they talk about, which is I
think that's true in all walks, really. But and what we've done more and more is just be very transparent about what's going on. So when press officers make that terrible mistake, and I don't know why they do it, it's the worst thing you can possibly do as a press officer, is to intervene in an interview and try and correct something, or say, "Right, time's up, we're not doing that," or "We're not talking about that." It's the worst possible thing you can do, because we will now generally run it. And there's been an expectation in the past that press managers could intervene, and there would be there's an unwritten code between us all where they can manage these things. You've got to make it unmanageable for them, and so that they must know that if they ever try and intervene in an interview, you'll record it and you'll show it, or you'll write it up and you'll say this is what happened. And if they want to be part of the conversation, then they're going to be on the record. Yeah. And the trouble is, when you do that, when you challenge them, as you were saying before, you do risk them not bringing people to you again.
Who do you think's been your most unmanageable, or what's been your most unmanageable situation? Not unmanageable from your point of view, as in you can manage yourself, but you've been in a room and you've just felt that the interviewee and the rest of the people there representing them just like, wow, this is going in the wrong direction. Barring, of course, Tarantino, which we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's very rarely the interviewees who are unmanageable. Even very wary government ministers are kind of generally find they expect to be questioned, and they're more than capable usually of handling it. It's the press and PR people who often misjudge things and are trying to protect people when it's just inappropriate. The number of times you now go into an interview and some PR person goes, "You've got 3 questions," and you just go, "Oh, just go away," just shut up. This is the most stupid thing to do in the world, is to put the backup of the interviewer before they've even begun. Why are you trying to annoy me before I've even asked my first question? Or they'll try and say, "So this is just about X, isn't it? We're not going to talk about Y. What are you going to ask?" That's the most stupid question a PR can ever ask you. What are you going to ask them? As if I'm going to tell you in advance. So all of those sorts of things that make them unmanageable, and they're unfortunately really common, and all over the world. I was just in America actually recently, doing some stories around these terrible police shootings, and we went to one small town, and the mayor was trying to manage the situation, and he didn't have any PR help or anything like that normally, and he was a young guy, but he was very open, and I just grabbed him as he was walking past and said, "Can we do an interview? We're going to be here for 5 minutes, we're from London, blah blah blah." And he was like, "Yeah, fine, come over." But he'd hired in this PR company to manage his PR while he was in the middle of this crisis, and this PR person literally came out and said, "So you have 3 minutes, you can ask 5 questions, and what are they going to be on?" And you just thought, you are the worst PR person I've ever met, because your job is to make the media feel like you're open and helpful, and not to just annoy us before we've even asked the first question. And she kept trying to intervene, and I sort of ignored it, and just plowed on, and he was fine. So it's very rarely the interviewees themselves who have any kind of problem. And quite often I find people are quite surprised that you haven't got to them. If you've been trying to get someone for ages and their people have kept saying no, and you see them and you say, "It's been an absolute nightmare trying to get hold of you," and they're often quite surprised, and aren't always aware of the extent to which they are being protected. I mean, there might be some disingenuousness with politicians on that, but the level of control these days is extraordinary, and it's often controlled from the centre, and people who are more than happy and more than capable of talking to the media are just prevented from talking to the media for all sorts of different reasons.
On a similar vein, my first ever Tour de France, we attended what were then Team Sky's press conference, and we sat down, and it was one of those sort of big, there's 30, 40 media in the room, broadcast and written journalists, and they said there'll be 4 questions from broadcast, and then we'll open to the floor, which was sort of, there was, all the broadsheets were there, we were there, and foreign media as well. So the broadcasters asked their questions, fine, 2 written journalists. And then the next hand that went up was David Walsh from the Times, who famously was the man who sort of busted the Lance Armstrong case. And he asked a question about doping straight to Dave Brailsford. the question was avoided, and then out of nowhere, the press conference shut down, and everyone got led out. And that as well, if anything, stokes some of the beliefs of some of the people, some of the journalists in the room who may have already had a certain opinion of who you were interviewing and of Team Sky or Dave Brailsford, rightly or wrongly. That only helps to sort of add fuel to the fire there. That there was one difficult question from David Walsh. He's quite a notorious journalist in our industry. And then there was, after that, no more questions. It was quite an odd,
a much bigger story.
Yeah,
I had exactly the same thing yesterday with a story on the news involving Prince William and Gordon Brown, who had a meeting in Edinburgh, which we revealed on the programme. And we happened to have a crew outside Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh when they arrived, and they filmed from the pavement, but were told that that was Crown property, and for privacy law reasons, we shouldn't use that material because Gordon Brown, who was being photographed by our camera, was inside the palace compound. Even though you could just see it, a member of the public could just see it from where you were standing normally outside the palace. That kind of thing I find really surprising, because you kind of think, you're making this a bigger story than it is. The minute you say you can't show something, or you can't do something, or you can't ask something, or you shut down a press conference, you're making a big fuss over something that, if you just answered the question and moved on, would be much less fuss.
And we're journalists, so it's going to make us want to ask the question even more. So yeah.
I had that. I did quite a famous interview with Jeremy Corbyn once in 2015 when he was first standing for the Labour leadership, and it caused a lot of controversy, and some people hated it and some people loved it. And it was because I was asking him about his statement about whether Hamas and Hezbollah were his friends, and it took quite a long time, sort of backwards and forwards, to get to the final answer. And I remember after the interview, I just said, if you'd have just said that at the first, we'd have moved on. We wouldn't have spent 5 minutes arguing over it. And so you kind of think the same thing, sort of just answer the question. It's very interesting listening to Dominic Cummings this week. And you might, you can ask yourself questions about, is he telling the truth now? Was he telling the truth then? Will the real Dominic Cummings stand up? But what he seemed to have concluded after this last year and a half was that it's better to tell the truth. It's better to be transparent, even though he was the person in Downing Street who was absolutely shutting down transparency and controlling the message. He's now saying, actually, what I've learned is it's better to be honest and open and transparent with the British public. I really hope that's really what he has learned, because I've always said this to anybody who has ever asked me publicly or privately for my, for advice on how to handle questioning in the press. Just answer the question. If you're not a crook, you've got nothing to fear from answering the question. And even if it's difficult, even if it's controversial, if you tell people sincerely what's going on, if you're a bike team who've had a problem in the past but are now tackling it, if you're honest about that, if you're sincere about that, who's going to attack you for it? All you can do is do your best. And people are actually, I think, really, people want to be fair. They want to give people, the benefit of the doubt on the whole. And so when there have been scandals, if you front it up and say, yeah, we made a mistake, or we had a problem, or, we're trying to tackle it, it's even if you don't have the answer, even if the answer is, we don't honestly know how to solve this problem, but we're thinking about it and we're trying our best and we're talking to people, that's got to be better than getting angry and shutting down a press conference.
So a part of you, though, with the Dominic Cummings story that thinks that it's just a well-timed vendetta?
Well, I think there's certainly some scores being settled. Yeah, I mean, the evidence was selective in terms of who he talked about. If you think about who he pointed the finger at, it was Matt Hancock over and over and over again. He was settling scores with Boris Johnson, with Carrie. He didn't talk about, a lot of other people who were involved a lot of the time. Michael Gove barely got a mention. I thought he was quite involved in the COVID response. There were all sorts of people who didn't really get a mention, and he was incredibly generous to Rishi Sunak. And people might say, well, could that be because Rishi Sunak might be a candidate to be the next prime minister? So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's, he's not a fool. and so he will have been careful about what he said. But as I say, I think wasting time denying things that are kind of obvious to everybody is a real mistake, because if everyone can see the truth, then don't try and deny it.
We've come to the end of our allotted time, Krishnan. But before we go,
we've been talking very seriously all this time.
I know we've got two sort of light-hearted questions just to finish with, just to bring us back round. And the first one, and this was again took us a long time to write, was if you was to head to Alpe d'Huez, which is a famous climb in France now, with Hugh Edwards and Mary Nightingale, and race to the top, who would win?
I suspect Hugh is quite fit at the moment because he's into boxing,
right?
And he's he's got super fit. So I would probably put my money on Hugh, but I don't know whether he is whether he's just boxing fit, or whether he can propel himself forwards. So I don't know. I mean, depends what bike I'm on as well.
If you have the e-bike, and then
exactly, if I have the e-bike, then I'll definitely win. But yeah, I mean, I'm always, very modest about my own abilities. So I would have no doubt that I would be at least second and probably third.
Very diplomatic.
True Anchorman style as well.
Yeah.
I hope.